Today we're going to come back and we're going to pick back up in 1 Corinthians. Now, in case you're new with us, we've just been going verse by verse through 1 Corinthians. And the great part about 1 Corinthians is that, and just to remind you, because this is huge for you to get. You know, so much of viewing 1 Corinthians, or really any book in the Bible, a lot of times people look at it through their own lenses, and they fail to see not only what Paul is saying, but why he's saying it and to what group he's saying it to. And the context is huge in understanding 1 Corinthians. And it's because today, some of today's passages are some of the most politically incorrect passages, especially when people look at them and don't understand what they're reading or seeing. But as I've shared with you, today will be an interesting thing, because today I just again, like I always like to do, just let them speak. Let the passage speak. As a believer, and that's the big thing that you learn about 1 Corinthians, and this is huge. This is huge if you want to understand, is that this is written for believers, right? This is written for those who are his. And this is who he's called us to be. But more importantly, it was specifically written to those in Corinth. Now, I'll go ahead and share with you. We're talking about believers in Corinth. And they had become, the gospel of Christ, there'd been a great there'd been a great movement, right, of the Lord in Corinth, but it was a decadent, okay? It was a decadent place, this place called Corinth. And I've already shared with you a little bit about it. But God was working. People were believers, right? But the problems they were having adjusting to being believers in such a decadent place. I told you about Corinth. It was ancient Greece. And it was a very wealthy area, a lot of commerce and business, a lot of transportation, right, that happened in and out of Corinth. A lot of education, right? It was, other than the Athens, that was probably the intellectual hub of the day. Corinth had plenty of that, had a lot of entertainment, sports, and other things. I've already told you in the weeks past, it was the patron goddess of Corinth was Aphrodite, so there was a lot of sexuality, right? I've already told you about the prostitutes, the priestesses, right? And it just this place. But within this, there was a group of believers that God had changed their lives. These weren't generations of believers who had allowed some of this stuff back in their life. No, these were first generation believers who were learning not to allow the culture to continue to rule them. If you keep that perspective, it will help you understand 1 Corinthians. And it was written to those that are his. Okay, that is the key, right? So he's writing all these things. Today's title is Marriage and Freedom. And when you see those two in the same title, we're going to share several things, because Paul just starts addressing struggles they were having. They were having all kinds of struggles. In fact, it was crisis mode. In fact, I'll even go past crisis and call it chaos. You'll see it all in the passage here. Is that, remember, you were having these Corinthians, right? And they'd lived a part of this culture, you know? And now they were believers, and some of them were so ecstatic about being a believer, and about what freedom really meant and what it meant to grow in that freedom. And so a lot of them, the Corinthians, they had a real excessive type personality. And again, they went one whole way, or they went one whole the other, and there got to be kind of this chaotic feel. Well, what had happened was several things had happened in and among, marriage and sexuality. It just was part of the things that Paul had to address. But this whole marriage thing started struggling because a lot of people were just so sick and tired. You see, we laugh and joke in our culture about the whole sexual thing because it's fairly prevalent. But when you have been immersed in that culture and it's so decadent, it messes you up, all right? And when it's just a free-for-all, it messes your mind. And so see, a lot of these Corinthians, they had been changed. God had changed their lives, and they were so thrilled, to have forgiveness. They were so thrilled to be going different paths that they went to extremes. In fact, some of them went to the extreme of zero, no sex whatsoever, right? I mean, they were still married. You'll see it. This is what Paul addresses. This is all here. I just need you to know why he wrote what he wrote. And so they were like, there became this big, no thank you, right? And then there began to be a problem of those who were believers, right? Who become believers were still married to those who were not believers. And so what was happening was, they were so thrilled to be believers, they just started divorcing, right? Their non-Christian spouses, right? And which went great for the testimony of Christ in the area, right? And so Paul had to address them. You have to remember chaos, guys. Absolute chaos in this whole area. So as you read this passage, read it with the eye gate of Paul trying to restore some kind of order, if you will, among all the chaos. Because they had all of these feelings and all of this stuff going on. They knew something was different. But as my old coach used to call it, it was kind of like a blind dog in a meat house. They could smell it everywhere, but they didn't know what to do, right? Does that make sense? They had no idea, and so Paul's just trying to help them. If you'll keep that, and you'll keep this thought that this is Paul's advice, even commands, it all shares it here. So let's jump into it. Number one, instructions on marriage. All right, number one, is Christians married to Christians? So the first group he addresses are believers. So in their case, it was probably believers who basically both spouses were believers. So both spouses had become believers in Christ. So he addressed them separately. You'll see it in the passages. See, the cool part about going verse by verse is because most people skip this passage because it's controversial and can easily be taken out of context, all right? But I want you to hear every bit of it, all right? Now, chapter 7, verse 1, it says this, now concerning the matters which you wrote, all right? So Paul is saying to them, hey, listen, you were writing me about a whole lot of stuff. So let me share with you a few things. Number one, he goes on to say, okay, it's fine. It's not wrong, all right? It's good for a man not to have sexual relationships with a woman, right? But because of, and that vice versa, right? It's always vice versa when you go through here, all right? You'll see it. Sometimes it says, sometimes it doesn't, but it's implied, all right? Now, the husband, and he goes on to say this. I want you to hear this. So that's the problem that some of them were having. Because when you have so messed up that area in your life, right? When you finally feel a freedom from it, you get this extreme to the other end. But the problem is that you have a spouse. So Paul makes some statements here. And boy, these have been taken out of context. But listen to what he says here. All right, because verse 2 it says, but because of temptation towards immorality, right? Each man should have his own wife and each wife his own husband. It says there, and the husband has, basically should give his wife her rights, right? And likewise the wife to her husband. Now, it says here, for the wife does not have authority over her own body. That's real politically correct, by the way, in our day. Thank God he says the other way too, all right? All right, for the wife doesn't have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So understand, guys, as believers, if you're his. Now, if you're not his, this doesn't apply. I mean, it applies, but it's different. And he's addressing it as such. In other words, in a marriage to where you're his, God talks about two becoming one, and he talks about the commitments and, if you will, basically the if you will, rights that have to do within a marriage of the two becoming one. In other words, I'm not going to do that anymore. It's not totally your call. That's what he's saying. But you have to understand the culture in which he's saying it. You've got some, those that have just gone so extreme to this other end that he's looking back at them and he's saying, hey, guys, all right, I just want you to understand you're going out of bounds. If you're his, all right, if you're his, this is not who he's called us to be. This passage has been so used and misused, all of these passages. You're going to see as we continue to look through them, all right? But if you'll keep and understand why Paul is having to address it, it's just because of where everything has gone here. It says, he goes on in verse 5, he says, don't deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement, that is, it being mutual for a short amount of time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again. Interesting, huh? So as believers, if both of you are believers and you're married, right? There's a time that both of you can agree on if you want to spend some time with the Lord together, perhaps. I don't know what it looks like. See, this all has to do with being his. If you're not his, this won't make sense. Does that make sense to you? That's why you and I, guys, as believers, we don't pin this stuff on an unbelieving world. All right, number one, they don't understand. And number two, God's called us to be his. And that you and I have a hard time living the way he's called us to live if he hasn't made a difference in our life. Does that make sense? So why are we gonna pin this on other groups of people who wouldn't have the strength inside of them to live the way he's called them to live anyway? You need to share the gospel with them. That's what they need to hear the most. You see what I'm saying? So this is those who are truly his. This is what he's telling you. So there's this great, powerful look here of what it means to be his and what it means to be married to someone, right, that is his. Now, let's read some of the rest, because some of this is some interesting. So that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. That's obviously sexual type control. He says, now as a concession, not as a command. Listen to what he's saying here. So now as a concession, not as a command. All right, I'd just like to say I wish everybody was like me, Paul said. But each has his own gift of God, from God. One is of one kind, one is of another. To the unmarried and the widows, all right, I say to you, it's good for them to remain single as I am, all right? But if they can't exercise control, let them marry, for it's better than to marry than to constantly burn with, right, passion type thing, right? What it's saying. It says, so to the married, I give you this charge. Now look, you're going to see a couple of parentheses really interesting here. Usually people just read over them, but I just want you to hear them. He says, now I have a command for you from the Lord. It says here, not I, but the Lord has a command for you. So this is not just advice I'm giving you, Paul said. This is God's command. So if you're his, this applies to you. And here's the command, that the Lord should not, that the wife should not separate from her husband and vice versa, right? But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. Vice versa, same thing, husband, wife, right? And a husband should not divorce his wife. If the two are believers, right? This is the picture, right? Picture of what it means to be his. It is the picture of a passage that, again, in Corinth, saying, guys, if you truly are his, right, then the two become one, and that is God's command to you. Paul says it very straightforward. All right, so we have then this picture between two people who are married as believers. Number two, what about those who are believers married to those who are not? All right, well, it's pretty straightforward here too. Now, but I do think it's interesting he says it this way. Let's just read the passage. Let's see what it says. It says this, to the rest of you I say, and listen how he parentheses puts this. I say it, not the Lord. You hear what he's saying here? Right? So what's he trying to do? Why? Because the Bible and the scriptures don't have a rule for every little eventuality. So Paul is telling them, hey, listen, let me just give you some godly advice here on some of this stuff. Why? Because they're living in chaos. I mean, things are out of control. People are all over the place. And this becomes something that he just really wants them to hear and understand, to stabilize, really, the situation. Let's take a look at it. So to the rest of you, I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother, what does it mean, brother? That is someone who's a fellow believer. Brother and sister in Christ is the thought here. Any brother, if he has a wife who's an unbeliever, and she wants to stay with him, she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. So I shared with that earlier, see, because what was happening was a lot of people were coming to the Lord, and as they were growing in their faith, they had this spouse who was not a believer, and they were just starting to divorce them. That is not who God's called us to be, as his. Why? Because he's called us then to, who knows what God might do, to allow, right, the change that God is working in your life to be an influence on someone else. Interesting, huh? Interesting. So now you understand why he's saying it, right? Right? Should not. And that's vice versa. So if any woman has a husband who's an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, it's just the same thing the opposite way, right? He should not divorce her, right? Now, so I want you to see again then what's he mean by those things? Well, it's just simply what that is. Because you never know how God's going to do this and what he's going to do, right? All right, take a look, again, verse 13 is pretty much straightforward, just what it says. Look at verse 14. For the unbelieving husband or wife, whichever one it happens to be, is made holy because of the one who is a believer. What does that mean? Well, it means that they're living in the light, all right? It means that at least they're seeing the light, right? At least they're understanding the gospel of what Christ can do in someone's life in you, right? And he goes on to talk about the children too, of how important it is for the children in that unbelieving type situation, right? Right? Now, but look at verse 15. He does tell you about this piece. This is interesting, right? He says, but if the unbelieving partner separates, you know, if the partner, that is the spouse who's an unbeliever, you know, looks and says, okay, I'm tired of living with the Apostle Paul, right? I've seen that before, to be honest with you. Okay, no, I'm tired of this. No, thank you. I don't want any part of this. And then they leave. It says here to let it be so. This is interesting what he says. In such cases, the brother or sister, that is, those who are believers, is not enslaved, or better yet, is not bound to anymore. Does that make sense? In other words, there's nothing you can do about that one, right? And there's no bonding there anymore, right? Because how do you know? He goes on to say this. He says, listen, for how do you know, right, wife or husband, that God might use you to make a difference in their lives? You never know what he's going to do. But the big part about this is that it's not all about you. That's what Paul is continuing to try to teach throughout the book of 1 Corinthians, right? And it's almost like, because I hear it all the time, you know, well, I'm just not happy. What does that matter? Right? If you're his. Now, if you're not his, it doesn't make sense. Yeah, knock yourself out, obviously, be happy. But if you're his, happiness is not the ultimate goal. It's being who he's called you to be and the difference he can make in through your life, right? If you constantly live with the thought of, well, I have to be happy, you will make a lot of bad decisions. Just simply because that is such a fickle thing and it changes so much. That's why Paul's trying to stabilize the situation. You'll see it in a minute. He's just trying to get them to stop making decisions in this chaotic time, because usually they're going to be the wrong ones. You'll see it in just a minute. All right, so only let a person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, to which God has called him. This is my rule among the churches. You know what? This will help you guys stabilize some of this. And then he gives you another little bit of an example. Look what he says here. He says, and was anyone at the time of his call? Now look where it says there, the time of his call, or the time of her call. What's he talking about there? That's the time you became a believer, right? That is at the time in your life when you understood who Christ is and what he came to do, and you put your faith and trust in him. There's a new creation, all of the stuff that goes with it. So that time, so he says, at the time when you became a believer, all right, were you already circumcised, all right? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. I don't know how you do that anyway, to be honest with you. I mean, I guess there's something maybe removed. I don't know what you would do, all right? And so, but let's just see what's happening. Let's see what he's saying here. Why is he even saying this? Well, there are some that are like, well, I need to go try to undo this because that didn't have anything to do with me being a believer. And then he goes on to say, was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Well, don't seek it, right? Look at verse 19. For neither one of them, circumcision counts for anything, nor does uncircumcision. But obviously being his, following his commands. Therefore, look at verse 20. This is classic. This helps you understand why he's telling you everything he's just telling you. Just for right now, just stay where you're at. You hear what he's saying? Just remain in the condition in which you were called. In other words, why? Because, well, let me give you a few illustrations. Right? As being his, all right. When you think about a question like this, if you're his today, you've got some desires inside of your own heart. If you're his, if you're not his, you can't manufacture those desires. But there are desires to know him and all the different things that come with it, to be who he's called you to be. If you don't have those desires, you're probably not his. But as we understand what that means, question, right? What is it that would make a person be closer to God? I mean, there's only about 100 books out there about that one, right? Christian books. How to get closer to God. Listen, look at me. Look at me. This is what this is talking about. There is only one thing that makes you close with God. And that's what Christ did at the cross. You will never, ever be any closer to him than you already are. Because Christ and who he is and what he came to do made you perfect in his eyes. And you can't improve on that. Does that make sense? And yet you'll have hosts of people around you that tell you, yeah, but okay, Christ and what he did, that's good. Glad you're a believer, but you've got to do this and this and this and this and this, even down to circumcision and uncircumcision, whatever that is, right? So he's just telling them, hey guys, stop. None of that has what you're looking for. Everything you need is found in him. This is what he's trying to tell them, right? And as this chaotic time, especially for Corinthians, stop doing all these crazy things because they were so immature. They were just going from thing to thing to thing, right? Since it was such a highly sexualized city, he had to keep talking to them about that. So basically total abstinence from all sex, right? Just boom, way over here, he said, and you've got these that they're all the way over here. They're divorcing their spouses because they're not believers. And God wouldn't want me to be married to an unbeliever, would he? And it just was so all over the place, and they were constantly making these decisions, and it was chaos. They couldn't even see to understand what was going on. So much of what Paul's writing them here is, guys, just hang where you are. Just stop. Why? Because the scripture says something that's really interesting. And you've heard it before, but perhaps it'll mean more to you now. It says to seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and then what? He'll make sure you know everything else. So the first thing is to stop doing all this stuff and focus on seeking him, right? And as you start seeking him, he'll make all these other things clear, all these little questions that are being asked now. Isn't that interesting? He says it here in just a minute. Let's get to it, all right? He goes on to say, this is something interesting too. He says, were you a bondservant when you were called? Remember what we talked about? What does when called mean? It means when you became a believer. That is the day you put your faith and trust in Christ. Were you a slave? Is basically the answer. Now, for that may seem really foreign to some of us. This is when you have to understand the times in which it was written. All right? As much of, in a lot of the cities at that time, is that there were as many as 70% of the population of the Roman Empire were slaves, right? And this meant all kinds of things. A slave could be, yes, someone who's chained, digging a ditch, but a slave could also mean a cook. A slave could also mean someone who was an accountant. They just were employed by somebody, or were owned by somebody, right? I mean, this looked as different as you can imagine. So Paul had to address this. And look what he says. So you were a slave when you became a believer in Christ. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. But if you can get your freedom, go for it. He says, for he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman in the Lord. So if you are a slave, then understand God has set you free. He says, but if you're free, likewise, if you're freed, you've been called a bondservant of Christ. Therefore, you're his. Interesting is what he's trying to say there. Listen, don't worry about it. All right? You seek him first, and then he'll take care of the rest. Why? Because you were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. In other words, you and I just don't understand, but sometimes in this culture, if you got into so much debt, you could actually, there was a price. You could sell yourself into slavery to pay off your debts. And so what he's saying here is, do not do that as a believer. That doesn't really apply to us today, right? I just want you to see what it says, because it's pretty cool when you're looking at what he's telling them. So brothers, listen, whatever condition that you were in when God made the difference in your life, just hang right there, right? It's pretty good advice. Hang right there and make sure that you're seeking him. Let things stabilize when you learn what it means to be his and be a follower of his. And then he'll make clear some of these crazy issues that you guys are getting caught up in. Hear what he's saying to the Corinthians. I just want you to see it because, guys, these Corinthians were excess type people, right? They were all or nothing, right? You're going to see it with the spiritual gifts here in a few weeks. Craziness, just craziness that was happening all around them. Everything was out of control. So Paul's just trying to get it. Now, number 3, this won't take us long. These are believers who are unmarried. So these, remember, he had a word he wanted to say to the believers who were married to each other, right? He had a word he wanted to say to those who are a believer married to an unbeliever. And then number 3, he has a word to those of you who aren't married. Now, this is really interesting stuff. But remember who it's being written to. I'll remind you of it along the way. Now, there's 15 verses here that I want you to see. Look what it says. Now, concerning the betrothed, that is those who are not married but are going to be, right? Are intended. All right, I have no command from the Lord. In other words, there's no command here, but let me give you some advice. All right, just some godly advice, Paul says, about where I see where all of you are. Right? He goes on to say, but I give you my judgment as one whose the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it's good for a person to remain as he is. Okay, that's an eye gate into the chaos that is going on around them in Corinth. Look at the verse again. In view of the present, what? Distress. In other words, guys, y'all just y'all need to calm down, is basically what it's saying. Hang on. Stop making all of these decisions in this emotional state, crazy state, chaotic state. And this is why he's saying, just however you are right now, just stay that way for a little while. All right? Because no decision is better than a bad one, is basically what he's saying. Excuse me. He says, are you bound to a wife? Don't seek to be free. All right? Are you free from a wife? Don't seek a wife. All right? But if you do marry, you haven't done what's wrong. See, there was even groups of them, you haven't sinned. There are even groups of them saying is that this is God's will for our lives, that we never get married, and it's a sin if you do. Paul's saying that's ridiculous. See, you see the extremes of where they were? They were all over the place. So Paul is trying to confront every bit of it, but there's just not enough ink space, right, to tell them every little eventuality of what could or couldn't be or whatever. Basically, that's why he's saying just hang where you are, right? But if you do marry, you've not sinned, and a betrothed woman married, she's not sinned. So he's trying to lay this to rest. He said, but yet those who marry will have worldly troubles. Well, amen to that. All right? This is just something he's telling them. And I would like to spare you that, all right? This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short, and from now on, let those who have wives live with those they've had none. Right? Let those who mourn as though they were not mourning, yet those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing. I'll explain this in a minute. Let those who buy as though they had no goods, right? And those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away, right? But I want you to be free from all of that. Free from all of what? Free from trying to find what you're looking for in the chaos that is this world, right? Right? He says the unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord and how to please his wife, right? Excuse me, and how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. But see, guys, this is not always. This was the time in Corinth at this particular time. He says interests are divided. And the unmarried or unbetrothed or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about pleasing her husband. So it just is back and forth, right? At both sides. He said, I'm saying this for your benefit, at least for the time, he says. That's what he says. I'm not trying to lay a bunch of rules on you. That's why he's trying to tell them, man, guys, this is some advice I have for you that will help you out, at least for now. He says, I'm not trying to put a bunch of rules on you. But I am here to tell you this, is that most of the time, these passages, when they are taught as rules. But yet Paul says the exact opposite is my goal. Right? Interesting, huh? He says, but what I'm trying to do is just to get some order and to secure within you your undivided devotion to the Lord. In other words, guys, forget about all that for right now. Stay right where you are. Focus on being a follower of the Lord, and then seek him first, and then he'll add all these things to you, and he'll lead you right. He'll take you in the right directions. He'll make sure you know exactly what you need to know, right? It's an amazing thing when you begin to see why he's writing what he's writing. If anyone thinks he's not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let him then marry, and there's been no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, excuse me, right, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart, right, to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well. But he who refrains from marriage does even better. At the time in which they're living and the chaos, it's probably pretty good advice. But let me tell you this This is not what he means totally. Because you and I know as well with one another that one of the greatest things that can be a great testimony is two people who are married and who love the Lord with all their heart. And that their desire is to, both of their desires, because the two are one, is to be who God's called them to be. Obviously, God can use that in unbelievable ways. But they were so out of kilter here, there was just no way that any kind of marriage that was going to go on that was going to not cause major problems. Does that make sense? When you see what he's saying, you're like, oh, that is what that says. Right? And he goes on to say, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. And that goes the other way too, right? Now, let me tell you this before I move any further. Be real careful. Going back to the one with the married believer versus those who aren't believers. It says if they want to stay, then let them stay. You need to stay. Don't divorce them. Let me tell you, look at me. There is not anywhere in that passage, and it's just wrong. I get so irritated with sometimes these things, these different movements that go on that try to say this. There is no way intimated that you are to stay with a spouse is violent or abusive. Guys, that is not what it's saying. It's not even implied. And to try to make it say that and imply that is just someone who's not his. You know it's not there. So under no circumstances do any of us say that. But to remember this, it's not so much about us, it's about who he is in our lives. So a wife, look at verse 39, or a husband is bound to their spouse. But if the husband dies, she's free, right, to marry whom she wishes. And it says here, but only in the Lord. Guys, it's implied if you're his, then he expects you to marry someone who also is his. Does that make sense? And that's just implied, right? The reason they had such a problem is because they were first generation believers, right? Again, just letting it speak, right? Yet in my own judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. That is, I think God's speaking through me to you, right? I'm just about to be done. I'm going to give you just, and voice is about done. Number 2, and this is where we're going to pick up next week. But I only want to give you a thought here because of how it connects with what we've just taken all this time to talk about. You see, when you think about freedom, number 2 is instructions on freedom. In fact, if you're truly his today, you are far freer than you realize you are. In fact, sometimes it's probably good that believers don't know just how free they really are. Because I think we would make a lot of immature decisions if we found that out, right? You'll find out that this is next week. Freedom is amazing. Galatians, it was for freedom that Christ has set you free. Freedom is an amazing thing, but it also comes with a great deal of responsibility. I have been teaching and have shared with the parents in our parenting class is don't ever give a kid, one of your children, freedom, right? If they don't have any responsibility. They're gonna make a mess of things, right? There's great freedom in handing the keys to your car, right? But if there's no responsibility there, you're cruising for a bruising. Do you know what I'm saying? It's the same way as you as a believer. You have amazing freedom that have been bought by you by what Christ did at the cross. But we are to self-limit our own freedoms to serve. Now, I'll share with you, and I promise we'll be done in just a few minutes because there's a lot of this we want to pick up, but I want this on your mind this week, all right? Number 1, all right, number 1 is just knowledge. Look at 1 Corinthians 8:1. It says, now concerning food offered to idols. Okay, Jeff, that doesn't really relate. It does more than you know. You have to remember that everybody in Corinth is a believer in something. There were no atheists, okay? And they were all pagan. That is, they all believed in the gods and goddesses of Mount Olympus. So I have been to Corinth. I've told you about this. You walk down, and I can close my eyes, I can be there. And all this area to the right were just temple upon temple upon temple. I've already told you about the big temple to Aphrodite was up on the hill. But all the other temples were there. Temple to Apollo, I remember that one being rather large. Asclepios, some of the other minor gods and goddesses. And so right next to it was the agora, or the marketplace. And so you would sacrifice animals to these false gods. So let's say Apollo, you were going to sacrifice to Apollo. So you would bring a goat or whatever, right, alive, and you would bring, it would be killed, and the only part of it used in the sacrifice was the blood. A little gross, I know, but that's the way it was. And so what happened is, after your sacrifice was over, the goat or the meat was taken right next door to the marketplace and put on sale. Because as you know, a dead animal has a shelf life. Everybody know what I'm talking about? Therefore, they greatly reduced the price. Jeff, where are you going with this? I promise I'm going somewhere. Okay? They greatly reduced the price. Why? Because it only had so much time. And then they would sell it, right? And so people, believers, were buying this meat that had been offered to these false idols. Well, that makes sense, right? Because it was greatly reduced. You could get a bargain, right? Now, concerning food sacrificed to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. What is he talking about? You'll see it. This knowledge puffs up, right? But love builds up. So yes, you have freedom, and the knowledge of what that freedom looks like is amazing. But if anyone imagining that he knows something, he does not yet know, all right, as much as he ought to know. That always is the way it works, by the way. Number two is just simple love. If anyone loves God, he is known by God, right? Therefore, as eating food offered to idols, we all know, what is it, the knowledge he's talking about here? Again, I'm going to share this again next week, but I want this in your mind to think about. We know that what? Idol's not real, right? It's just a hunk of stone, just something people made up, right? Now, in the imagination of all the worshipers, it's real. But as believers, we know it's nothing, okay? So, there shouldn't be any problem with buying the meat, right? None. I mean, you talk about getting meat for a lot less than normally you would. There's no God but one. And all because there's many gods, right? So-called gods, he calls them. But indeed, okay, there are many gods, many lords. Guys, there is a lot of freedom. Look at me. There's a lot of freedom that comes with knowing the truth about things in this world that exist and don't exist. Superstitions, right? When you got the truth, you can be free from a lot of those things, and that's what was happening. Yet for us, there's just one God, the Father, from whom all things, and from whom all things we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, to whom now all things and through whom more exist. But as a conscience, here's the thought. This is what I want you to hear as you walk out the door. I want you to think on this one. Right? However, not all possess this knowledge. In other words, there are some people that have just become believers and they have worshiped these false gods all of their lives. And it freaks them out that you would actually eat food that had been sacrificed to a pagan god that they used to worship. Does that make sense? So, and it just almost destroyed them. So then, as someone who has freedom, you have the freedom to do whatever you want to do. I'm going to limit my freedom so that my immature, younger brother, sister in Christ, it doesn't mess them up. Basically, that means I would rather pay triple for meat than to cause, using my freedom, than to cause someone else to stumble. Does that make sense? See, not everybody possesses this knowledge, but some, through former association with idols, right? They used to be idol worshipers. They eat food that was really offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. It just messes them up. Why? Because they haven't grown to a point to where they're past that. He goes on to say, hey, food doesn't make you closer to God. You're no worse off if we do not eat, and you're no better if you do. You hear what he's saying? This doesn't make you closer to God. Why? Because there's only one thing that makes you closer to God, and that's what Christ did at the cross. There's even folks today, even, that, they call them biblical foods. It makes you closer to God, and because you eat these foods. It doesn't. I don't want to bust your bubble, but it doesn't. Why? Because there's only one thing that makes you close to God, and that's what Christ did at the cross. And there's great freedom when you understand that. But take care that this right of yours, that is, this freedom of yours, doesn't cause someone else to stumble who's weaker. All right, I'm done. But here's what I want you to see from that as you go. What does that mean? See, this is the kind of stuff that Paul's trying to teach them as believers, that he's called us to something different. Now, let me also tell you this. Just a couple things, and then, come on up. Anthony, listen to this. This is funny. And there's some folks this is really going to bother, but God bless you, all right? All right, look at me. Notice here that those who get offended are the ones who are weak. And the more offendable you are, the weaker you probably are. As we grow in him, all these ancillary things, and we understand our freedom, they don't offend us as once they did. Also, be real careful because they're all around us. I call them the professional offended brother. They actually look for things to be offended by, right? Don't let them manipulate you into doing what they want you to do because they're offended. Does that make sense? We're going to pick this up next week. Such good stuff in understanding these early days, but also how it relates to us. We'll talk a lot more about this next week.